The Varrock Dragon Pack had once been the undisputed sovereigns of the Frostspine Mountains. For centuries their fire had painted the night sky amber and gold, and their thunder had rolled through the mountain passes like a second storm living permanently among the peaks. Travelers from distant kingdoms would stop at the valley's edge just to watch them circle the high ridges at dusk. 11 massive silhouettes riding the frozen thermals with the effortless arrogance of creatures who had never once doubted their place in the world. The villagers below both feared and quietly admired them, the way people often admire things powerful enough to destroy them, but ancient enough to have chosen not to. The pack was a family in every sense that mattered. Sorath, the silver-scaled matriarch, had led them through drought, through rival packs, and through the kind of brutal mountain winters that killed everything without fire in its belly. Goreth had guarded their northern flank for 30 years without a single breach. The twins, Vile and Vesson, had grown from reckless hatchlings into fierce, loyal hunters who still raced each other across the sky like they had something to prove. Every dragon in the Varrock pack had a role, a history, a place, and woven through all of it was the shared, luminous anticipation of the 14 eggs resting warm and gold in the nesting caves, pulsing gently with lives not yet fully begun. Then the cursed night arrived, wearing the face of an ordinary winter evening. No one saw the sickness come. It carried no smell, made no sound, left no mark on the cave walls. It simply moved through the warmth of the nesting chambers like a cold thought and touched each egg with something that could not be fought or burned away. By midnight, the shells had begun to crack, not with the violent, joyful force of healthy hatching, but slowly, as though the creatures inside were simply very tired. 14 hatchlings emerged into the torchlit cave. 40. No one told Sorath what to do. No one could have. She was the matriarch, the oldest, the most scarred, the one who had always known what the pack needed before they knew it themselves. But in the gray hours after the hatchlings fell still, something in her ancient eyes shifted in a way none of the others had ever seen before. The fire that had lived behind her silver gaze for over a century, steady and sure as a lighthouse, flickered once and went somewhere very far away. She began with the first small body, the one nearest the cave entrance. She lifted it with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible for a creature her size, cradling it against her chest the way the pack had watched her carry injured members after battles, carefully, as though the damage could still be undone with enough gentleness. She walked the long path to the cliff's edge alone, in the blue-dark silence before sunrise, and she laid the hatchling down where the mountain met the open sky. Then she went back for the next one, and the next. 14 times she made that walk. 14 times she returned to the cave with empty arms and a face that revealed nothing, which was somehow worse than if it had revealed everything. The pack watched from a respectful distance, standing absolutely still in the snow. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them approached her. They understood instinctively that this was something Sorath needed to carry herself, the same way she had always carried the hardest things, quietly, completely, without asking to be relieved of the weight. When the last small body had been laid at the cliff's edge, Sorath sat down and looked up at the frozen sky. The sun was beginning its pale, indifferent climb above the eastern peaks. She watched it rise and said absolutely nothing. Goreth sat down behind her, then Vesson, then Viel, then the others, one by one, each folding silently into place like the last notes of a song resolving into quiet. They fell into. Goreth had once been the kind of creature that made the sky look small. His wingspan stretched wider than any dragon in 3 generations of Varrock blood, and when he launched himself from the northern ridge on a clear morning, the sound of it, that enormous, percussive crack of wind catching under his wings, used to echo through the entire mountain pass like a declaration. The villagers below had a name for it. They called it the Varrock Thunder, and mothers would lift their children onto their shoulders to watch him rise, because even fear, when it is magnificent enough, becomes something close to wonder. After the hatchlings died, Gorath stopped making that sound. He hunted when his body demanded it and returned immediately without circling. Yet without the lazy, triumphant glide he had always allowed himself after a successful catch. He ate quickly and folded his great wings back against his sides like a bird bracing against a storm that never actually arrived. The sky above the frost spine, which had always seemed like his personal territory, his element, the one place he moved with absolute freedom, became something he simply passed through on the way back to the rock. He no longer looked up at it. There was nothing up there he wanted anymore. The twins fared no better. Vial and Vesin had spent decades as the pack's most relentless entertainers, their aerial races a daily spectacle of sharp turns and sudden dives, and the kind of reckless speed that made even Sorath watch with reluctant admiration. Now they pressed themselves against the black rock face of the eastern cliff and stayed there, wings folded tight, bodies curved inward like wounds that had closed over something still broken underneath. They slept too much. They ate too little. They stopped looking at each other with that private twin language of glances they had always shared. 11 dragons on one mountain, 11 separate silences, each one slightly different in texture and way. The first winter after the hatchlings died was the longest any of them had ever lived through, not because it was colder than previous winters, though it was cold enough, not because food was scarce, though the pack hunted so infrequently that hunger became a dull, permanent companion none of them bothered to complain about. It was long because grief distorts time in a way that nothing else does, stretching ordinary days into something vast and featureless, like a plain of snow with no landmark in any direction and no particular reason to walk toward one horizon over another. The pack moved through those months the way the very old sometimes move through their final years, present in body, but with some essential part of themselves already somewhere else entirely. The second winter arrived before any of them felt ready, which was almost amusing in a bleak way, because none of them had been doing anything to prepare. The seasons, indifferent as always, kept their own schedule regardless of who was suffering beneath them. Snow came early and came heavily, blanketing the frost spine in white so deep and complete that the mountain's sharp edges softened into something almost gentle. It settled on the dragons where they rested, on Sorath's silver scales, on Gorath's broad back, across the folded wings of Vial and Vesin, and they did not move to shake it free. A healthy dragon sheds snow the way water sheds from oiled feathers, with an instinctive, casual shrug that sends it scattering in small white clouds. But the Varrock pack wore their accumulating snow the way the bereaved wear dark clothing, not consciously chosen, but somehow exactly right. It covered them slowly and completely, and they let it, and after a while the pack and the mountain became nearly indistinguishable from one another. Travelers who had once detoured specifically to glimpse the Varrock dragons now passed through the valley below and saw nothing moving on the high ridges. The village of Kermath had lived in the shadow of the Frost-Spine Mountains for 11 generations. In that time, its people had developed a relationship with the Varrock pack that defied simple description. It was not friendship. Dragons and humans rarely arrived at anything so uncomplicated. It was not purely fear either, though fear was certainly present, woven into the foundation of every Kermath household the way cold is woven into stone. It was something older and more layered than either of those things. A mutual awareness, a careful, long-practiced understanding of boundaries that had kept both species alive and relatively intact across more than a century of shared mountain air. The elders of Kermath remembered when the Varrock thunder meant Gorath was flying, and children ran to doorways to watch. And they remembered trading seasons when dragon-scorched clearings made the best farmland, and nobody asked too many questions about how the clearing happened. They remembered the unspoken agreement: stay below the third ridge marker, make no move toward the nesting caves, and the pack would leave the valley to its business. It had worked reliably for longer than anyone could personally recall, which was precisely why what happened next unsettled everyone so deeply. The broken dragons were a different kind of unknown entirely. An angry dragon, the eldest of Kermath's council explained to anyone who would listen, operated on instinct that was at least predictable. It issued warnings, a burst of flame aimed deliberately wide, a territorial roar designed to carry, a posture so unmistakably hostile that even the foolish understood the message. An angry dragon still wanted something, wanted its territory respected, its dominance acknowledged, its boundaries honored. Wanting something meant communicating, and communication, however terrifying, was a language humans could work with. A grieving dragon wanted nothing, needed nothing from the world beyond tea. Solia Vren had been disappointing cautious people since she was old enough to walk toward things she had been told to walk away from. It was not recklessness, exactly, or at least that was what she told herself, and occasionally managed to convince others. It was more a fundamental inability to accept that fear, simply because it was loudly and repeatedly expressed, automatically qualified as wisdom. She had watched too many people in Kermath spend their entire lives not doing things because someone older had once decided those things were dangerous. She had noticed, with the particular sharp attention of someone who pays close attention to patterns, that most of those people died having never tested whether the danger was real or simply inherited, and passed down through generations like old furniture nobody actually liked, but nobody thought to question either. Her mentor, the healer Devan, called it stubbornness with delusions of philosophy. He said it the way people say things they find simultaneously exasperating and secretly admirable. He was also the reason she was climbing the frost spine on a gray Tuesday morning with an empty satchel and frost already forming on her bootlaces. Silver thread moss grew only at elevation, specifically the kind of elevation that began roughly where Kermath's unofficial boundary markers ended and the Varek Pack's territory began. It was the single most effective treatment for the lung sickness currently moving through the village's older residents, tightening chests and stealing sleep. Inan Devan had exhausted every lower altitude alternative he possessed. He had mentioned the shortage 3 times in 2 days without once suggesting she go and fetch it herself, which Solia understood perfectly well was his method of asking, without technically being responsible for whatever happened next. She packed her satchel before sunrise and told nobody specific where she was going, which was not quite the same as lying. The Emda? She found the silver thread moss exactly where Devan's old field notes said it would be, clinging to the shaded underside of a granite outcrop just below the second northern ridge, pale green and feathery, smelling faintly of pine resin and cold water. She was filling her satchel with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to complete a task and leave before the universe noticed she was there, when the mountain decided to remind her that it had not actually agreed to any of her plans. The snow shelf was invisible. That was the particular cruelty of it. It looked identical to every other section of the ridge she had crossed. Same color, same texture, same deceptive solidity that the frost spine specialized in offering to people who had not spent enough years learning to read its moods. Her left boot came down on it with complete confidence, the way it had come down on every previous step, and for 1 fraction of a second, everything was fine. Then the shelf spoke in the language of fracturing ice, a sharp, intimate crack that she felt through her entire leg before she heard it with her ears, and the mountain simply took her footing away. She went down fast, satchel swinging wildly, both hands scrabbling at the slope for anything with enough resistance to matter. There was nothing. The incline offered her smooth-packed snow and cold indifference in equal measure, and the crevasse at the bottom of the slide was widening in her vision with the horrible, accelerating clarity of something that is absolutely going to happen. She had just enough time to understand the situation completely, and not nearly enough time to do anything useful about it. The tail came from her left side with no warning whatsoever. It was enormous, and it was not gentle. It caught her mid-slide with a force that knocked every remaining breath from her body and swept her in a hard, unceasing arc away from the drop, depositing her onto solid ground the way someone deposits some tea. Gorath looked down at the small human on the ground and did not move. This itself was unusual. His instincts, the deep ancient ones that had governed his behavior for decades before grief had buried most of them under 2 years of snow and silence, were sending him information he no longer quite knew how to process. The instinct that said remove the trespasser was present but distant, like a voice heard through several walls. The instinct that said assess the threat ran its automatic calculations and returned a result so underwhelming it was almost offensive. One human. 14 years old at generous estimate, currently horizontal. Satchel contents. Moss. But underneath both of those familiar responses was something else entirely. Something that had no business being there after 2 winters of deliberate emotional vacancy. Something that felt embarrassingly, inconveniently like interest. He studied her the way he had not studied anything in a very long time, with actual attention, taking in details rather than simply registering presence. The frost on her bootlaces, the white-knuckled grip she still had on her satchel strap despite being completely stationary, the way her chest was working hard to recover breath while the rest of her held itself with a stillness that was clearly more performance than genuine calm. She was frightened, thoroughly, understandably, completely frightened. She was also, unmistakably, refusing to show it beyond what her lungs were involuntarily advertising. He found that interesting in a way he could not immediately explain. She looked up at him. Really looked. Directly into his amber eyes, with an eye contact that most adult humans abandoned immediately upon achieving it. And he watched her process the full reality of what was standing over her. He watched her arrive at the correct and reasonable conclusion that she was in an extremely vulnerable position. He watched her open her mouth. And then she said, The silence that followed her words was enormous even by Frostspine standards. Gorath remained exactly where he was, which Solia decided after several careful seconds was probably a good sign. She had no reliable framework for interpreting dragon behavior beyond the second-hand warnings of people who had never actually been this close to one. But she reasoned that a dragon intending immediate harm would most likely have already committed to it, rather than standing motionless with an expression she could only describe as profoundly uncertain. She filed this observation under encouraging and focused on getting her breathing back to something that resembled normal. She was still working on that when she noticed the others. They had arrived without a single sound, and which should have been impossible given their size, but apparently was not, because 11 full-grown dragons had formed a complete ring around her position without her hearing so much as a wing beat. They stood at varying distances, some closer, some hanging back at the ring's outer edge, but all of them were oriented toward her with that same hollow, unreadable attention that Gorath had fixed on her from the beginning. 11 pairs of ancient eyes, 11 massive bodies radiating heat she could feel even through the cold. 11 creatures who had spent 2 winters becoming invisible to the world, suddenly making themselves extraordinarily visible to her specifically. Any reasonable person would have run. Solia considered it genuinely and briefly, then rejected it on practical grounds. The ring was complete. Running would require choosing a direction, and every direction currently contained a dragon. More importantly, something in the quality of their attention, hollow as it was, grief-emptied as it clearly was, did not feel predatory. It felt, strangely and inexplicably, like something closer to bewilderment. They were not sure what she was going to do next. She realized this with Suddy, The second visit was harder than the first in ways Solia had not anticipated. The first time, she had not chosen to be there. The mountain had made that decision for her when the snow shelf cracked, and Gorath had made the next decision, and she had simply responded to circumstances rather than initiated them. There was a particular kind of courage available in moments like that. The reactive kind, fueled by adrenaline and the absence of time to think. It required nothing deliberate from the person experiencing it. Climbing back up the following morning was entirely deliberate. She had time to think. She had time to remember the size of them, the hollow weight of 11 pairs of ancient eyes, the way the ring had formed around her in complete silence. And she had time to revisit every warning she had ever heard from every cautious person in Kermath and acknowledge that those warnings were not entirely without foundation. She climbed anyway, with cold hands and a satchel she had packed more out of habit than necessity, and the deliberateness of it cost her something that the first visit had not. She arrived to find Gorath already watching the approach path. She could not have said with certainty that he had been waiting, but something in his posture suggested the mountain had been slightly less empty before she appeared on it. She sat down in her approximate spot from the previous morning and said good morning to no one in particular, and received no response, which she had expected. She stayed for 2 hours. She talked occasionally, small, inconsequential things, or the kind of conversation that asks nothing of the listener beyond their physical presence. She described a difficult patient of Davan's. She mentioned that the eastern path was icy below the first marker. She noted that the sky looked like more snow before nightfall, and she hoped she was wrong about that. The pack listened or did not listen. She could not tell and decided it did not matter. It was Vessen who moved first, which surprised no one who had known her before the grief settled in. Of the two twins, she had always been the one slightly less capable of maintaining sustained indifference toward interesting things. Viel was the more disciplined, the more watchful, the one who observed from a careful distance and processed privately before committing to anything. Vessen had always been constitutionally incapable of that kind of patience. Even in her current diminished state, wings folded, eyes dulled, pressed against the eastern cliff face like something that had given up on taking up space, some essential part of her original character was apparently still alive underneath the grief, waiting with the stubborn persistence of a coal that refuses to go entirely cold. The third morning, Solia visited. Yet Vessen was positioned perhaps 4 lengths further from the girl than the previous day. The fourth morning, she was 3 lengths closer than that. She executed these adjustments with an elaborate casualness that would have been almost convincing if she had been dealing with someone less observant than a healer's apprentice trained to notice small changes as diagnostic information. Solia noticed immediately and said absolutely nothing, which was exactly the correct response. Viel's shift was different in character, but equal in significance. She did not move closer, not yet, not with Viel's particular brand of careful deliberateness, but she began to watch. Specifically, she watched Solia's hands, which were rarely still during the morning visits. They sorted moss or repaired small equipment or simply moved through the unconscious gestures of someone thinking aloud physically. Viel tracked these movements with her head tilted at that angle that large creatures achieve when something small has genuinely captured their attention, sideways and slightly forward, ears angled, the posture of a mind that has temporarily forgotten to protect itself. It happened on a morning that gave no indication it would be different from any other. The sky was the particular flat gray of clouds carrying snow they had not yet decided to release. The wind was low and directionless, moving through the pass without commitment, stirring nothing significantly. Solia had arrived at her usual time and taken her usual position in the snow, and the pack had arranged themselves in their usual pattern. Vessen, closer than the day before, Vale watching with that tilted attention, Gorath on the northern rock, the others distributed across the ridge in configurations that had slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted from a ring of assessment into something that resembled if you were careful about the word, a gathering. Sorath had not moved during any of the previous visits. She remained on her rock at the cliff's edge, the same rock she had occupied since the night she laid the last hatchling down, with her silver head directed toward the horizon and her eyes holding that particular quality of distance that is not the same as emptiness, but is what emptiness becomes after it has been inhabited long enough to develop its own interior landscape. Solia had never approached her. She had understood from the first morning that Sorath was a boundary she was not meant to cross, not because the matriarch was dangerous, but because some grief is so complete and so carefully contained that approaching it uninvited would be a form of violence regardless of intention. So it meant everything, that Sorath came to her. She rose from her rock with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has made a decision that cost them considerably to arrive at. She crossed the snow in silence, each step placed with the gravity of the very old and the very certain. The pack went absolutely still. Even Vesson stopped pretending not to watch. Sorath stopped directly before the girl and looked down at her for a long moment with eyes. Nobody could have predicted it would be Gorath. Of all the pack, he had been the most consistently, most thoroughly sealed. Where Sorath's silence had the quality of deep water, still on the surface but with enormous pressure moving beneath, Gorath's had always felt more absolute, more architectural, as though he had not merely stopped speaking, but had restructured himself entirely around the absence of sound, the way a building restructures around a load-bearing wall that has been removed. Everything rearranged to accommodate the new shape of the loss, every beam and joint redistributed to keep the whole thing standing without the thing that used to hold it up. He had watched Sorath cross the snow toward Solia from his position on the northern rock. He had watched the silver head lower. He had watched the small human hand rise without flinching to meet it. He had watched the two of them settle into that stillness together, the ancient grieving matriarch and the 14-year-old healer's apprentice who had climbed a dangerous mountain for moss and stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with moss, and something in his chest had begun to shift in a way that had no clean description. It started below language, below thought, even. It began in whatever place the oldest feelings live before they become anything the mind can name, that deep interior geography where dragons carry the things that matter most to them, the things they would die for, the things that when lost leave chambers inside them that echo for years with the sound of what used to fill them. The rumble rose through him slowly, the way deep water rises, unstoppable once it has decided to move, indifferent to whatever is in its way. It was not a roar. A roar is a weapon or a warning shaped by intention and aimed at something specific. This was neither of those things. This was the sound of a locked door opening from the inside, reluctant and enormous and irreversible. The song began the way the most important things begin, without announcement, without preparation, without any of the ceremony that might have made it easier to receive. Sorath simply lifted her head from Solia's shoulder, straightened her ancient neck toward the flat gray sky, and opened her throat. What came out was unlike anything the Frostspine Mountains had heard before, which was remarkable given how many centuries of dragon sound those peaks had absorbed into their granite walls. It was not the Varek thunder of Gorath's great wings. It was not the sharp territorial declarations the pack had once used to mark their boundaries against rival clans. It was not even the deep collective rumble that had just moved through them all like a tide finding its shore. It was older than any of those sounds. It was the kind of sound that exists beneath all other sounds, the foundational frequency of creatures who have loved something completely and lost it without warning and continued breathing anyway, because breathing, unlike almost everything else, does not require a reason. It moved through the pass in waves, each one carrying something slightly different, grief in its rawest form in the low registers, and above that something more complex, more textured, something that contained the loss, but was not entirely consumed by it. The 14 hatchlings were in that song. Every golden eye that had opened once and closed forever was in it. But so was every year Sorath had lived before that night, and every member of the pack still breathing on this mountain, and something that sounded, impossibly, tentatively, like the first green thing after a long winter, like the faint, unsteady shape of continuation. The pack listened without moving. The mountain listened without moving. Solia felt the tears before she understood them, which was how she knew they were real. Manufactured grief announces itself and asks to be noticed. True grief arrives sideways. The spring came to the frost spine the way it always did, gradually, then suddenly, then all at once. The snow on the lower ridges softened first, pulling back from the dark rock in slow retreat, uncovering the pale beginnings of things that had been waiting underneath all winter with the particular patience of living things that understand seasons. The light changed its angle and its quality, arriving longer each morning and staying later each evening, and the mountain that had spent 2 years feeling like a sealed room began to feel instead like a window being opened by degrees. The Varek pack felt it the way all wild things feel the shift. Not as an idea, but as a physical reality moving through them, reawakening instincts that grief had suppressed but not destroyed. Igorath launched himself from the northern ridge one morning in the 4th week of the thaw, and the sound of it, that enormous, percussive crack of wind catching under his great wings, rolled through the pass and down into the valley below, and the people of Kermath who heard it stopped what they were doing and looked at each other with expressions that did not yet have words attached to them. The twins raced each other across the high thermals that same afternoon. They were rusty and slightly uncoordinated in the way of athletes returning after long absence, and neither of them cared even slightly. The pack hunted together for the first time in 2 years, moving in the old formations with the old communication, and when they returned to the ridge in the amber light of early evening, they settled close to one another rather than at the isolated distances grief had imposed on them. They were not healed. Solia understood this clearly and completely, and had never expected otherwise. The 14 hatchlings were not coming back, and the shape of that loss would remain inside the Varek pack for the rest of their very long lives, a chamber that would always echo differently than the ones Aero